Howdy, folks. This is Miss Sinclair from Miss Sinclair's History. Today, we are finishing up period 3 in AP US History. So that means we are going to be looking at topics 3.11 and 3.12, American Identity and Movement in the Early Republic. Let's jump into it. So I want you to think back. Can you identify 3 changes in America since the ratification of the Constitution to the election of Jefferson? So the Constitution is ratified in 1887. Jefferson is elected in 1787 to 1800. What has changed in the United States during that time? If you're struggling to remember this, it might be a clue that you need to look back and read your notes more closely, or maybe make a timeline, something to help you recall the information. So we're going to talk about how America is developing an identity at this time. And 3 changes would be, of course, Hamilton's Banking Act, the movement of the capital down to Washington, D.C., Alien and Sedition Acts, creation of political parties. So you will be able to explain continuities and changes in American culture between 1754 and 1800. So let's talk a moment to reflect on colonial society compared to American society post-revolution. Well, in colonial society in general, we expected to see self-government, religious tolerance, no hereditary aristocracy, and social mobility. So how many of these things stayed the same in an independent America, and how many of these things changed or disappeared? Well, let's look at post-revolution America and the role of women. Well, we see that women actively participated in the revolution. They worked as cooks and nurses. Some even fought in the revolution. Think about Mary McCully or Deborah Sampson. But the biggest contribution women made to the revolution itself was they kept the economy going. They kept farms producing food. They kept businesses in business. What about for white men, right? Opportunity and equality. Well, one of the ways that society in the United States was extremely different from that in Europe was the lack of a hereditary aristocracy, meaning just because you were born into a family doesn't mean you're automatically going to have access to power, right? You're not a prince, you're not a duke, et cetera, et cetera. And in general, Americans condemned inherited social privilege. We pride ourselves on being a country of meritocracy. We have legal equality. So we start to see these shifts in families, this idea of a Republican family. Now, when I say Republican family, do not think our current political parties, right? I'm not talking about the modern 2022 Republican Party. I'm talking about Republican as a form of government in which you vote for representatives who make laws on your behalf. So Americans at this time are trying to match their family structure to their country, right? This sense of equality, representation. So we see that people choose their spouses based off feelings instead of arranged marriages, right? Because you love this person, because you are friends with them, not because, well, if we marry our 2 houses together, we'll be able to conquer all of England or whatever. You have this idea of Republican motherhood. We see that before 1800, women spent most of their active adult years working on farms and raising kids. But after 1800, we see the crude birth rate drops, meaning women go from having an average of about 9 kids to having an average about 6. That's still lots of kids. But it's interesting to think about why. Why do we see this demographic shift? Well, one of the reasons is after the Revolution, and especially after the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, we see land out west opening up. Single men migrate west, leaving the women in the East to marry later in life or even never. This limits the number of children you're going to be able to have. We also see that urban middle-class families are choosing to have fewer kids simply because they don't want to split inheritance or they don't want to find identity solely in motherhood. But with the idea of Republican motherhood, women are accepting greater responsibility. It's a woman's job to raise up good citizens. So I think a good reflection on sort of the role of women, but also American identity is looking at the slave Phyllis Wheatley. She was a poet and she was published and well known. There's a great crash course African American history on Phyllis Wheatley. I would encourage you to watch it. It really goes into her life and it works well as a point of understanding American culture and society at this time. All right, let's talk a little bit about art and architecture. I'd like to apologize now for my podcast listeners. There are pictures on my PowerPoint that depict the homes and pieces of artwork I'm going to be talking about. So if you're listening to this on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify, you might want to click over to my YouTube channel to actually watch the PowerPoint slides so you can see what I'm describing. You are not going to get an AP question on what was the architecture style in 1730. That's not going to happen. But again, it serves as a helpful tool for us to reflect on American society, culture, what are we valuing, what's changing, et cetera, et cetera. I will be going through this pretty quickly though. So first piece of architecture we're looking at is the Westover House, owned by William Byrd, built in 1730. This is sort of your classic New England house. Byrd was the richest man in America. He got English artisans to design the home. It is made out of red bricks with white gables, a black roof, and over the door, there is a sculpture of a pineapple to show friendliness, but also show wealth, right? The only people who have tropical fruit are the extremely wealthy. Then you might look at the Wentworth Gardner home in Boston, 1740. Lots of gables. Those are the they have to do with windows. Like you might think of the House of Seven Gables by Nathaniel Hawthorne. It has a flatter roof, meaning you don't need to worry so much about snow. And once again, imported a lot of stuff from England. The Old State House in Boston, built in 1730, and Independence Hall in 1732 are very similar, right? They are in this sort of colonial style of red bricks, white sort of window frames, clock towers. It was Independence Hall where the Declaration of Independence was signed. All right, let's look at some art. Well, if you're thinking all the way back to like Puritan art, a famous one would be Richard Mathers, a painting of Richard Mathers. We don't know exactly who did it. This shows a classic wood block print. So that means you take a piece of wood, you carve into it, and the picture, in this case, it's a picture of a Puritan man, and then you press the wood into ink and stamp it on paper, kind of like you would a stamp. Another famous one is Margaret Gibbs Limner. We don't know exactly who painted it, but we know that this Limner family is going to be painted. Again, it shows wealth, right? That this Puritan family is having not only their family, but their children depicted. The most famous one is Elizabeth Freake Limner. You see here, she is depicted with her baby in her lap. The lace, the colors, the way that her embroidery is sort of specifically showing. It's a way to depict your wealth. Moving forward in time, we also see the painting of Deborah Hall by Williams. She is painted wearing this silk pink dress, touching red roses or pink roses as well, sort of showing her innocence and her beauty, and of course the wealth. All right, but if you really want to think of a 18th century American painter, the most important one is going to be John Singleton Copley. You have the painting of Epes Sargent in 1764. And this is significant because you're showing Americans here, right? He is a wealthy man. He's wearing a wig, but it's a standard wig. This is not the rolls on rolls on rolls fancy wig that you would see in England or even in France, where they're, think the court of Marie Antoinette levels of wigs and makeup and heels and silliness, right? He's wearing a simple gray coat. It's well made, but it's not high style. It's very pragmatic. He's from New England. He's a Puritan man. So this painting shows, what do Americans value? Hard work, right? Not fussiness, not fancy depictions. He's well dressed, but he's not overdressed. He is straightforward. You might also look at other paintings by Copley, like Mrs. Thomas Burlston in 1766, and her son Nicholas Burlston in 1767. You see with his mother here, the poor woman, this was not a very comfortable painting for her. She was painted in December on the second floor. She has to wear long underwear underneath all of this. But Nicholas is clearly having these paintings done. They are meant to depict his family, right? So his mother is wearing this beautiful silk dress, and you can see the way the light catches her skirt. And she looks a little uncomfortable in all this finery. Whereas her son, Nicholas, looks so comfortable, right? He is not new money like his mother was. He's a merchant. He's very arrogant. He's sort of looking directly at the artist. Unlike Epes Sargent, with his, staid and straightforward, this is a man who's showing off his wealth. He is wearing a brocade and silk robe. His vest underneath is silk. He's not wearing a wig at all. In fact, you can see how his head is shaved, and he's wearing this jaunty silk cap. He rests on a table with his arm on large books on a silk tablecloth, showing how educated he is. And in the background, you see this faint depiction of a ship at sea, right? He's depicting his exotic possessions, the fact that he's a merchant making his money at sea. But perhaps the famous ones you would know would be the ones of Samuel Adams in 1772. Samuel Adams, like Epes Sargent, he has a very simple wig. His suit is red, but it's not ostentatious. It's not frilled. And in his hand, he holds text, a roll of papers. A book is out in front of him, and he points to text. He points to another roll, a poster, points to sort of enlightenment, to the importance of publishing, right? This is 1772. We're not that far off from the Declaration. Let's see. Oh, yes. Paul Revere. Paul Revere was a silversmith. You might recognize the painting of Paul Revere by John Singleton Copley as the one that the internet thinks looks like Jack Black. Paul Revere here is sitting at a table. He's holding in one hand a silver teapot, tools of the trade in front of him. He's showing that Americans work. Americans are doers. He's not wearing a wig. He's wearing a shirt and a vest. His vest is unbuttoned. His shirt is untied around the neck, right? This is a man who's been doing hard work. His hand rests on his chin like he is thinking, he is working. So he's not, you see here, what do these paintings are interesting because what they are asking the artist to depict is what they value. So they are asking the artist to depict their hard work, that they're not ostentatious, that they take themselves seriously. Compare this to some of the paintings of Marie Antoinette and George III and Louis XVI, and you're going to see a distinctly different emphasis. All right, so if you are going to reflect a little bit on art and identity, I'd want you to think about changes and continuities in American culture. Here's something to think about. On the AP test, you will be writing 2 essay forms. One of them will be a long essay question. In both essay forms, though, you will be required to write a thesis statement. And it is really valuable to practice writing thesis statements, even if that's all you do, even if you don't write the rest of the essay. Why? Well, the thesis statement is supposed to be the easy point to earn. It's the low bar point. It's the one that the AP grader wants to give you. So you want to be able to, at the very least, go into that AP test knowing, all right, I know I can get at least 1 point. And I would argue that you should be able to confidently get at least 3 points on an LEQ, but that's a conversation for another day. But I would love for you to practice this. Write a thesis statement in response to this prompt. Evaluate the extent to which ideas of self-government influenced American colonial reaction to British imperial authority in the period from 1754 to 1776. So note those years, 1754 to 1776. So we are ending with the Declaration. We are not moving forward into the Revolution. I want you to also note that we are looking at the extent to which ideas of self-government influenced American reactions. So one of the biggest problems I see students making is that they will not read the prompt closely enough, and they will answer a prompt sort of adjacent to what the question is asking. So they might be like, what was the American reaction to imperial authority? Well, we had the Sons of Liberty. Well, we had the Tea Party. We had the boycott, blah, 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 which is great. That's a great essay. You could talk about what the American reactions were to British imperial authority. That would earn you 0 points on the AP test because that is not what the question is asking. The question is asking, to what extent did ideas of self-government influence American colonial reaction? So the first thing you have to ask yourself is, did ideas of self-government influence American colonial reaction? Yes or no? Okay, if you say yes, you might say a lot or a little. Okay, and then you start moving from there. So I'd encourage you to practice. All right, let's finish up period 3 by looking at movement in the early republic. So think back, what are 3 cultural features in early America? Think meritocracy, think equality, lack of social hereditary aristocracy. So like I said, we're finishing up with 3.12, movement in the early republic. So I would love for you to be able to explain how and why migration and immigration to and within North America caused competition and conflict over time. And please explain continuities and changes in regional attitudes about slavery as it expanded. All right, let's talk a little bit about Native Americans. We haven't talked about them in a little bit. So we're going to be going backwards in time a little bit. If you remember, after the 7 Years' War, the French ceded land in the Treaty of Paris. We saw that the Proclamation of 1763 was designed to keep American settlers out of the land west of the Appalachian Mountains. Well, we know that Americans were not happy with that. So after the revolution, when we are negotiating with Britain, they give up more land. So in the Treaty of Paris in 1783, they give up Northwest Territory, right? But the tribes that lived there protested. They said the British don't have the right to give up this land because it was never theirs to begin with. It's like I said, oh yeah, you can totally drive that car. Like you can have it, whatever. It's all yours. And the owner of the car is like, hey man, that's not yours to give away. So in the Treaty of Fort Stanwix in 1784, US commissioners threatened military action against pro-British tribes, such as the Mohawks, the Onagas, the Cayugas, and the Senecas, unless they gave up the land in New York and Pennsylvania. We want that land, and we are willing to use any means necessary to get it. And most of it is going to be immoral, right? Threatening violence to push people out of their home so Americans can use it. Commissioners will then go on to use liquor and bribes to take more and more land, confining tribes to reservations. And even without these deals, even if you assume surely some of the commissioners working with Native American tribes must have made good faith efforts. They all probably weren't, slime balls. Okay, sure. Let's assume some of them were making good faith efforts to negotiate with the Native Americans and find an equitable and fair resolution. The fact of the matter is, despite these negotiations, American settlers continue traveling west. They move into the Ohio Valley and beyond. And as they move further west, they are encountering more tribes, new tribes. So how do you deal with them? Well, there was essentially two views in the American mind. You either defeat them or assimilate them. They will use very similar tactics across the land east of the Mississippi. So in 1785, Americans will be able to persuade, these agreements were made under duress, so it's hard to claim that they were fair agreements if a gun's held to your head. But the Chippewa, the Delaware, the Ottawa, and the Wyandots will sign away most of Ohio. They didn't really want to. These agreements are made under threat. These tribes will join the Shawnee, the Miami, and the Potawatomi people in the Western Confederacy led by Little Turtle. They will rise up against the Americans to try and fight back and take their land. Initially, these tribes win very bloody battles against American militia. The Shawnee, the Delaware, the Iroquois, and others join the fight as well. Settlers are mad that, remember, there are still British forts along the Mississippi River and British soldiers in those forts. The British are supplying the Native Americans with weapons and encouraging them to attack, are giving them strategy and maps and resources. Well, that makes the Americans mad. They're like, that's not fair. Like, well, guys, you're invading their homeland. And the British kind of like, we're making your life more difficult, Americans. But all of this will lead to the Battle of Fallen Timbers and the Treaty of Greenville, which recognizes Indian ownership of the land, but it doesn't matter. The treaty also encourages white migration west. Thousands move to Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois and start conflicts with the native peoples there. The US government's response is basically, we won't have conflicts with the Native Americans if they just gave up their land, culture, religion, traditions, and became like us. Why won't these indigenous peoples become white Anglo-Saxon Protestants? Come on. Why would you give up everything that you hold dear to your identity to become like the people who invaded your home? Gosh, I don't know. Why wouldn't you want to do that? That sounds like a great deal. The indigenous peoples rejected this. Some might try to create some syncretism, some syncretic traditions, so blending traditions. For example, Handsome Lake of the Senecas included Christian elements in his rituals, but this will cause a divide within the Seneca tribe. Native women have no desire to be housewives. They have more political influence and agency in their tribal culture than American women do in the American political system. So this starts or really continues on what we will see to be the tragic and brutal history of the American government's treatment of Indigenous tribes. It's a history that is stained in blood and betrayal and lies. All right, but let's talk about migration into the United States. Well, it doesn't stop. If you're watching the if you're watching the video, not listening to the podcast, you'll see that I have a pretty neat map that shows how America's source of immigrants has changed over time. It's a GIF, and so it's really neat to see the source represented visually and how it's changing. So at this time in the 18th century, our main source of migrations will be Germans and the Scotch Irish. The Germans are arriving over with a little bit more money, right? They're arriving as families, and they're going to settle in farmlands west of Philadelphia. They will maintain their German language, customs, and religion. They'll be Lutheran. You might think of the Amish, Brethren, and Mennonite traditions. They are uninterested in English politics. So if you've ever heard the term Pennsylvania Dutch, it refers to these men and women and families of German heritage that settle in Western Pennsylvania and Ohio. They speak German. There is a distinct German tradition here. We also have a large group of migrants known as the Scotch Irish. So we will see a lot of Irish coming over to the United States, but at this time it's primarily from Northern Ireland. And these men, women, and families have very little respect for the British government. Remember, Britain's first colony was Ireland. They are coming over with very little money. So as the Germans are settling in the Ohio Valley and are able to buy up land to become farmland, the Scotch Irish are coming over without a lot of money. And so they are going to be staying in the cities, but also going to the edges of the frontier, especially the mountainous areas of Western Pennsylvania, Virginia, the Carolinas, Georgia, especially in the Appalachian Mountains. That's why if you listen to a lot of like American folk songs, they sound very Irish and Scottish. There's just a lot of that honor shame culture there, and it comes from this heritage. The land in the mountains is a lot cheaper, and so they're able to settle there. We have some other migrants as well. French Protestants to Huguenots come over. You see Dutch and Swedes to a lesser extent. The Swedes will really settle in Minnesota. But in general, American and European migrants go west. Settlers going west have more economic freedom and opportunity. They don't always have ready cash. So you might think about the North Carolina regulators, in which poor migrants claimed the right to back waste vacant lands. The poor were limited to buying only 1,400 acres, whereas the wealthy were able to buy 20,000 to 200,000 acres, leading to a lot of landless farmers in Kentucky. Land was bought up by corporations, by speculators. So we have essentially 3 migration streams going across the United States. The landlessness and opposition to slavery will be push factors that go into the Ohio Valley, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois. Slave owners migrate west along the Gulf, setting up more plantations in Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. We'll talk about how the Industrial Revolution and the invention of the cotton gin really makes cotton the valuable commodity. Then out of New England, you will see migrants going into New Hampshire, Vermont, and Maine, then eventually central and western New York. So, what do you think are some of the different priorities that we start to see to emerge in different regions? It's interesting to think about. Obviously, you might think about, well, slavery is valued in the South. Um, but the different religious traditions and ethnic traditions in the Ohio River Valley compared to the Appalachian Mountains, compared to New England, compared to the Gulf Coast, compared to the Chesapeake Bay region. One of the big things that we'll be talking about in Unit 4 is this idea of sectionalism, the North versus the South versus the West. It's going to be one of the big problems of Unit 4. All right, let's talk a little bit about slavery again. Well, one of the biggest events in slave history in the Americas is going to be the Haitian Revolution. We talked about this already. But the Haitian Revolution and its success freaks out American slave owners. White refugees from Haiti come to the US, spreading tales of the massacre and mutilation of slave owners. This reinforces American fears of slave insurrection. To white Americans, slaves were not men and women seeking liberty, but a danger. And the fact that they used violence to get their independence meant that they were unfit for self-governance. You obviously see the hypocrisy there. White Americans also used violence to achieve independence from Britain, but that didn't mean white Americans were unfit for self-governance. Hypocrisy is going to be like the backbone of the slave power. When Jefferson's president, he's going to try and quarantine and sort of destroy Haiti. Like, can we cut them off from trade and starve them out? So when you think about the American Revolution, the struggle for independence brings up the question of emancipation. Americans aren't dumb. I mean, some are, I assume. But if Americans are being like, oh, we're all going to be free, someone's going to be like, yeah, but what about those slaves? If we say all men are created equal, what about those people? And then you have the British Lord Dunmore's proclamation. Slaves who fled their owners and joined the British forces would be free. About 30,000 slaves escaped that way. Many went back to the United Kingdom, Canada, or even West Africa. Some African Americans supported the revolution. Free Blacks joined the army. Some slaves fought for the Americans for the promise of freedom. Virginia's Manumission Act of 1782 allowed owners to free their slaves, and 10,000 were freed. They're going to change that law, though. Plus, there starts to be intellectual and religious pressure for emancipation. The Quaker John Woolman and other American denominations began to promote abolitionism, emancipation. And Enlightenment philosophy challenges the ideas that Blacks were inherently inferior. But still, African Americans who were free had second-class citizenship in the North, and there were tons and tons of racist laws. Then, of course, you had the defenders of slavery. There's a real contradiction between liberty rhetoric and slavery in the South. Prime examples of this, of course, would be our founding fathers, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, free plantation owners in Virginia who actively owned slaves, who bought and sold them. We'll talk about Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings next time. But there's a contradiction here. In Maryland, they'll pass a law that will allow for slaves to be gradually freed. But in Virginia, concerns about free Blacks meant that citizens lobbied for legislature to repeal the Manumission Acts. And slaves could not be freed until after 1792. Thomas Jefferson argued that slavery was like holding a wolf by the ears, right? You can't let it go, but you're holding a wolf by its head. He argued that it was a necessary evil required to maintain white supremacy in the plantation lifestyle. South Carolina and Georgia sought to reopen the Atlantic slave trade between 1790 and 1808. We see merchants in Charleston and Savannah import 115,000 Africans as slaves. So this is a evil act, right? It's hard to look at the uncomfortable parts of history. It's more fun to look at the Declaration of Independence and the Boston Tea Party and like Americans are the victorious good guys, right side of history, and know that simultaneously, hundreds of thousands of people are deprived of the ability to move where they want, to marry who they want. They are vulnerable to sexual assault, to mutilation, to torture. Their children are ripped from their homes, from their hands. These are two truths that exist simultaneously in American history. And part of being a historian is grappling with that tension. We don't deny that the tension is there. Not all slaves sat back and were like, well, this is our life. And I want to be clear, because you don't have very many slave rebellions does not mean American slaves were content with their lot in life. But in almost every case, slave rebellions in North America were unsuccessful. And Gabriel's rebellion is going to be the same way. So in 1800, you see a slave rebellion in Virginia. Richmond blacksmith, Gabriel Prosser, his brothers Solomon, as well as a slave preacher named Martin, will plan a rebellion. They were skilled slave craftsmen who could read and write and could hire themselves out to other employers. And their owners got a cut of their wages. So if you were a blacksmith and you were a slave, well, you were still a slave. But if, Joe Schmo there needed a blacksmith, he could hire you and your owner got a little bit of money and you got a little bit of money, right? This was one of the ways that slaves could save up money to buy freedom. So Gabriel, Solomon, and Martin planned to march on Richmond, kill some whites, and hold the rest, including the governor, hostage until slavery is abolished. They had hoped that the poor whites would join them. He ordered that Quakers, Methodists, and the French would be spared. We'll talk more about how the slave system was bad for basically everyone. Poor whites suffered because of it. African Americans suffered because of it. Our country will suffer because of it. On the night, though, Gabriel was going to carry out his plot. There's a storm and the roads are washed out, so they can't do it. And as they wait for the opportunity to arise again, their plot is discovered. Gabriel and 25 other slaves are hanged, and dozens are transported out of state. Gabriel had gathered recruits at Black Baptist churches, funerals, and other gatherings. So what's the reaction to all of this? Well, as you can imagine, it wasn't great. After 1800, the Virginia legislature tightened controls over the Black population. They could not congregate on Sundays without white supervision. Any slave freed after 1806 had to leave Virginia or be sold back into slavery. So imagine this. Imagine you save up enough money and you want to free your wife. So then any children you have with her will be freed because slave status followed the mother. But if you free her, you can no longer be with her. She would have to leave Virginia by herself. If you raise enough money to free your son, you would never see them again, ever. Right? It puts this tension between, yes, you'll have freedom, but you'll have to give up every person that you love and hold dear, everything that you know, right? You have no contacts outside of your small community. It's not like you're like, well, I can Google search somewhere to live in New York and I'll move up there and find a job. You don't know what the slave laws are in other states. We also see that Virginia passes laws to restrict individual freedom and legal equality to whites alone. So Gabriel's rebellion ends all discussion of emancipation in Virginia. So we start to see sectionalism, some distinct differences between the North and the South. We see that the North had better education and public services than the South. For example, in 1800, a county in Virginia spent about 25 cents per person on education and public services, whereas in Massachusetts, they spent about $1 per person. You see the relationship between slavery and national politics. Northern states begin to end slavery because it becomes a political issue. At the Philadelphia Convention, Northern states had to agree to 20 more years of slave trade and to return fugitive slaves. Southern states will dominate the presidency and the Senate, keeping slavery protected. Right? Think about how many of our presidents are from Virginia. George Washington, Virginia. John Adams, Massachusetts. Thomas Jefferson, Virginia. James Madison, Virginia. Monroe, Virginia. There's John Quincy Adams, Massachusetts again. Like, it's the slave power in the Senate is real. So the real question, of course, is going to be the West. Migration west depended on your view of slavery. People opposed to slavery migrated west in the North, Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, and clustered there. Remember, the Northwest Ordinance Act of 1787 outlawed slavery in the Northwest Territory. People who supported slavery migrated west in the South, into Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. And respective economic bases reflected this. You saw yeoman farmers, so small family farms in the North, and large plantations in the South. This problem and these economic differences are not going away. They are going to be some of the biggest, they're going to be the theme of next unit. So I would love for you to watch the Black American history video from Crash Course on slave codes that really illustrates the life and lived experience of slaves in the young United States. So I would love for you to explain how and why migration and immigration to and within North America caused competition and conflict over time, and explain the continuities and changes in regional attitudes about slavery. Thank you for listening. This is our last lecture for period 3, which means next time we'll be starting unit 4. Remember, you can listen to this on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify, and you can watch the videos on YouTube. Please consider leaving a rating and review. My goal for this is to be a resource for students, teachers, and anyone who wants to learn about U.S. history. If you are a teacher and you're finding this helpful, please know I have resources on my Teachers Pay Teachers page, these PowerPoints, these lecture notes, quizzes, projects. These can be an asset for you. In fact, if you use my PowerPoints, you can assign these videos to your students if they're absent or need to make up some work. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.